There are monsters that we create in fiction to explore the darkest corners of human morality. We invent characters like Dexter Morgan, killers who live by a strict code, vigilantes who only hunt the wolves to protect the sheep. We tell ourselves that this specific brand of evil, this justified madness, is just a story. But in the sweltering heat of Brazil, that story was real. He didn't work in a forensics lab in Miami. He was born into poverty, violence, and blood. He claimed over 100 lives. He killed 47 people while he was already locked inside maximum security prisons. He was a man who eventually walked free to become a social media star, giving life advice to teenagers on TikTok. His name was Pedro Rodrigues Filho, but to the world and to the terrified inmates who shared a cell with him, he was simply Pedrinho Matador, Killer Petey. And to understand the sheer scale of his violence, you have to understand that Pedrinho didn't just kill, he purged. But before we get to the prison massacres or the moment he stood over his own father with a machete, we have to go back to the very beginning. Because some psychologists argue that sociopaths are made, while psychopaths are born. In Pedrinho's case, the violence started before he even took his first breath. Pedro was born in 1954, in a small farm town in the state of Minas Gerais. His welcome into the world wasn't a warm embrace. He was born with a visible deformity, a bruised, battered skull. This wasn't a birth defect. It was an injury. While Pedro was still in the womb, his father, a violent and abusive man, had kicked his pregnant wife in the stomach during a rage. That kick impacted the developing fetus. Pedro entered this world, literally marked by his father's violence. He was born with a headache that would never go away, a neurological wiring that was perhaps short-circuited from the start. He grew up in a household where brutality was the only language spoken. He was beaten. He watched his mother be beaten, and he learned very quickly that in his world, the person who strikes first is the person who survives. By the time he was a teenager, the concept of mercy was alien to him. The beast truly woke up when Pedro was just 14 years old. His father was working as a school guard at the time. The local municipality fired him, accusing him of stealing food from the school kitchen. Now, whether his father actually stole the food is up for debate. But to young Pedro, the truth didn't matter. What mattered was the disrespect, the humiliation. He watched his family plunge deeper into destitution because of what he perceived as a false accusation by the vice mayor of the town, a man named Alfinas. Most 14-year-old boys would be angry. They might shout or vandalize a wall. Pedro walked to his grandfather's house, took a shotgun that belonged to the old man, and marched into the middle of the town square. He didn't hesitate. He didn't tremble. He walked right up to the vice mayor, raised the shotgun, and pulled the trigger. The blast killed the official instantly. In the chaos that followed, mere moments later, Pedro realized there was another loose end. He believed a fellow guard was the real thief, the one who had framed his father. Pedro tracked the man down and shot him too. 2 bodies, broad daylight, 14 years old. There was no going back to school after that. There was no going home. Pedro Rodrigues Filho was now a fugitive. He fled to Mogi das Cruzes, a dense urban sprawl in the state of Sao Paulo. For a teenager on the run, Mogi was the perfect place to disappear. But it was also a place where you had to be a predator to avoid becoming prey. He fell into the drug trade immediately. But Pedro wasn't just a low-level runner. He had a taste for it now. When he arrived, he found work with a local drug lord, but Pedro's internal logic, his twisted moral code, began to surface. He discovered that his boss was dealing heavily, but treating his subordinates poorly. Pedro killed him. He didn't just take his life, he took his business. He effectively promoted himself to kingpin by eliminating the competition, along with 2 other gang members who dared to challenge him. He was not yet 18, and he was already leaving a trail of bodies that baffled the local police. But amidst this bloodshed, something human happened. He fell in love. Her name was Maria Aparecida, though everyone called her Botinha. She was the one soft thing in his hard life. For a brief window of time, it seemed like Pedro might find a reason to slow down. He was living with her, operating his illicit business, and managing to stay one step ahead of the law. But in the world of Brazilian gang warfare, love is a liability. While Pedro was away, a rival gang leader decided to send a message. They couldn't get to Pedro, so they got to what mattered most to him. Pedro returned home to find Maria Aparecida murdered. If the bruised skull at birth was the spark, and the vice mayor was the flame, the death of Maria was the gasoline explosion. Whatever small tether Pedro had to humanity snapped in that moment. He didn't grieve in the traditional sense. He went to war. He rallied his own men and hunted down the rival gang. He didn't just want them dead. He wanted to extinguish them. He tortured people for information, cutting through the criminal underworld of Mogi das Cruzes like a scythe. He killed the gang leader who ordered the hit on Maria, and he killed 6 others in the process. He was 18 years old. The police finally cornered him. When the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the authorities thought the nightmare was over. They thought they had neutralized the threat. They had no idea that they were simply moving the shark into a smaller tank. They were about to send Pedro to prison. And tragically, that is exactly where he wanted to be, because by then he had received news from home. He had learned that his father, the man who bruised his skull in the womb, had committed an act so heinous that Pedro had a new mission. Going to prison wasn't a punishment for Pedro. It was a commute to his next crime scene. The news that reached Pedro inside his holding cell was enough to shatter the mind of a normal man. While Pedro was out waging war for his murdered girlfriend, his father, the man responsible for his indented skull, had finally completed the cycle of domestic violence he started decades earlier. Pedro Rodrigues Sr. had murdered Pedro's mother. And he hadn't just killed her. He had butchered her with a machete, striking her 21 times. Pedro wasn't mourning. He was calculating. He was now in police custody, heading into the harsh Brazilian penal system, but he knew something the officers didn't. His father was in that same system. The authorities, in a display of catastrophic bureaucratic negligence, placed the son in the same facility as the father. It didn't happen immediately, but the moment is etched into the dark history of Brazilian criminology. Pedro waited. He bided his time until he could get close to the man who had tormented his existence since conception. When he finally cornered his father, there was no conversation. Pedro exacted his revenge with a precise, symbolic fury, matching the violence his mother had endured blow for blow. But what happened next crossed the line from simple vengeance into the realm of nightmares. Standing over the body, fueled by a lifetime of hatred, Pedro committed a final, unthinkable act of desecration involving his father's heart. He wanted to ensure the monster was truly gone. It was a gesture so primal, it cemented his reputation instantly. The other inmates realized they weren't looking at a poor 19-year-old boy anymore. They were looking at something far more dangerous. Usually, when a criminal is caught, the violence stops. For Pedrinho, incarceration was just the beginning. He treated the penitentiary like his personal domain. Over the next few decades, his list of targets continued to grow. Of his estimated 100 victims, 47 were taken while he was inside the prison walls. The authorities were desperate. They moved him from facility to facility to break his momentum. It backfired. Wherever he went, the violence followed. There is a famous story about one of these transfers that illustrates exactly how dangerous he was. The police placed Pedro in the back of a secure transport van. He was handcuffed to another prisoner. The journey was long, the roads were bumpy, and the guards were separated from the inmates by a metal grate. When the van finally arrived at its destination and the officers opened the back doors, they recoiled in horror. The other prisoner was dead. His neck was broken. Pedro sat there, calm and collected. When the guards demanded to know why he had done it, Pedro simply shrugged. He told them the man was a rapist, and in Pedro's world, rapists forfeited their right to breathe. He had killed the man with one hand while cuffed in a moving vehicle. This became his modus operandi. He appointed himself the judge, jury, and executioner of the Brazilian prison system. His code was rigid. He hunted those he deemed unworthy. Rapists, pedophiles, and those who preyed on the weak were at the top of his list. In a strange twist, this made him a sort of folk hero to the general population on the outside, and even to some inmates on the inside. He was cleaning house, but his code wasn't always so noble. As the years dragged on, his tolerance for annoyance evaporated. The line between righteous vigilante and psychopath blurred until it disappeared. He didn't just kill the worst of the worst. He killed anyone who crossed him. In one instance, a cellmate made the mistake of snoring too loudly. Pedro warned him. The snoring continued. The next morning, the guards found the cellmate dead and decapitated. Pedro had decided that his sleep was more valuable than the other man's life. On another occasion, an inmate cast him a disrespectful look in the yard. That inmate didn't make it to dinner. He tattooed a message across his body that served as a warning label to anyone who got too close. It read, "Mato por prazer," I kill for pleasure. The prison guards were terrified of him. In maximum security prisons, the guards usually run the show, or the massive organized crime factions like the PCC run the show. But Pedro was a faction of one. He refused to join the gangs. He killed their leaders just as easily as he killed a nobody. He would engage in his daily workout routine, hours of calisthenics to keep his body a lethal weapon. And if anyone interrupted his set, they risked death. He survived riots where dozens were slaughtered. He survived assassination attempts by rival gangs who wanted to claim the fame of killing the king of killers. He would make shanks, improvised knives, out of anything he could find, sharpening spoons or scraps of metal against the concrete floor until they were razor thin. The Brazilian legal system has a maximum sentence limit. By law, no one can be kept in prison for more than 30 years, though this has changed slightly in recent times. Pedro's combined sentences totaled over 400 years. He was never supposed to see the sun again. But the calendar kept turning. The 1980s bled into the 90s, and the 90s into the new millennium. Pedro Rodrigues Filho the fire in his eyes was still there, but the world outside was changing. Technology was advancing, governments were shifting, and eventually the legal clock ran out. The monster was due for release. In 2018, the unthinkable happened. The heavy iron gates of the penitentiary swung open, and Pedro Rodrigues Filho walked out. He was 64 years old. He had spent 42 years of his life in a beat cage, technically longer than Brazilian law allows, but the system had kept him as long as they legally could. His original sentence was nearly 4 centuries, but in Brazil, the maximum time a citizen can serve is limited. The calendar had simply run out. The man who had chewed his father's heart, the man who had decapitated a cellmate for snoring, was now a free citizen. The public held its breath. People expected him to disappear into the shadows, or perhaps return to the favelas to command a new army of drug runners. They expected a bloodbath, but Pedro did something that no one, not even the most seasoned criminal psychologists, predicted. He didn't pick up a shotgun, he picked up a smartphone. In one of the most surreal twists in true crime history, the Brazilian Dexter became a YouTuber. He rebranded himself. He launched a channel called Pedrinho Ex-Matador, PD the Ex-Killer, and he didn't just get a few curious clicks, he became a viral sensation. He amassed hundreds of thousands of followers on YouTube and TikTok. He would sit in front of a camera, wearing a t-shirt and a baseball cap, looking like any regular grandfather, and he would tell stories. He commentated on high-profile crimes happening in Brazil, offering his expert analysis on police manhunts. He showed off his workout routines, urging young men to stay fit and healthy. But most jarringly, he became a motivational speaker. He used his platform to warn teenagers about the dangers of the criminal life. "Crime is not a game," he would say, looking directly into the lens with those cold, dark eyes. "Don't walk the path I walked. It only ends in suffering." He signed autographs in the streets. He went on popular podcasts, sitting for 3-hour interviews where he calmly described the sensation of stabbing a man, all while sipping water and checking his watch. For 5 years, he lived this strange second life. He was a celebrity, a pop culture icon, a living relic of a violent past that seemed to have been forgiven, if not forgotten. He claimed he had found Jesus. He claimed he was a changed man. He said he only wanted peace. But the streets have a long memory, and in the underworld, there is no statute of limitations on blood debts. The past finally caught up with him on a Sunday morning, March 5, 2023. Pedro was in Mogi das Cruzes, The same city where he had fled as a 14-year-old boy. The same city where his first girlfriend was murdered. The city where his war began. He was standing on a sidewalk in front of his sister's house, holding a child in his arms, chatting with family members. It was a sunny, peaceful morning. Around 10 a.m., a black car turned the corner. It wasn't speeding, it was prowling. The vehicle pulled up to the curb near Pedro. Two men in masks stepped out. They were calm, professional, and precise. They told the family members to grab the child and get back. They didn't want collateral damage. This was specific. This was business. Once the child was safe, they opened fire. Pedro was hit multiple times. He collapsed onto the concrete, the same concrete he used to rule, but the assassins weren't taking any chances. They knew who this man was. They knew his reputation for survival. So after shooting him, one of the attackers approached the body with a knife and slit Pedro's throat, nearly decapitating him. It was a gruesome echo of the very violence Pedro had inflicted on so many others. The car sped off, and the killers vanished. To this day, the exact motive remains a mix of rumors. Some say it was the PCC, the massive criminal organization that Pedro had defied for decades in prison. Others say it was a revenge killing for a murder he committed 40 years ago, a debt finally collected by the grandson of an old victim. Pedro Rodrigues Filho died as he lived, violently, publicly, and shrouded in mystery. His death marked the end of an era. It closed the book on a life that feels like fiction. Here was a man whose skull was bruised by his father before he was born, who murdered that same father and ate his heart, who slaughtered 47 men in prison, and who spent his final years chasing likes and shares on the internet. His story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Was he a monster? Undeniably. But was he also a victim of a brutal environment that molded him into a weapon? Perhaps he operated on a code that made sense only to him, punishing the wicked while becoming one of them. In the end, Pedrinho Matador thought he had escaped his history. He thought he could rewrite his ending on social media. But violence is a boomerang. You can throw it as hard as you want, but eventually it circles back. Pedro Rodrigues Filho is gone, but the legend of the boy who killed the vice mayor and cleaned out the prisons remains. A cautionary tale that reminds us, you can serve your time, you can change your name, and you can even become famous. But you can never, ever outrun your own shadow.